All right, it's Pastor Michael Rote here again with you. Continuing on with our series, our little short series on alcohol. Episode 1, we talked about, Jesus turns the water into wine, so then drinking alcohol is okay. And we talked about that and how that argument doesn't hold water scripturally. And today's series, our series on alcohol, episode number 2, we want to talk about this. They drank wine in biblical times because they had no clean sources of water. That's an argument I've heard before too. When it comes to this subject, people say, well, they had to drink wine. They had to drink things like that in biblical times, even on up into the 16, 17, 18, even some of the early 1900s. They drank wine in those times because they had no clean sources of water. Is that a legitimate argument? Well, they had no clean sources of water. They had no means of water purification, and so they had to drink these things. Well, let's talk about that. Does that hold water? They drank wine in biblical times because they had no clean sources of water. I want you to look at John chapter number 4. John chapter number 4, and I want you to look at verses 1 through 15. John chapter number 4, verses 1 through 15. When therefore the Lord knew how that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee, and he must needs go through Samaria. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Verse 6. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. So apparently you could drink from this well. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. For whence then hast thou the living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. All right, so I know this passage of scripture, we know that this is referring to Jesus as the well of living water. He is the living water, and I know this is talking about salvation, but this is also telling us about the most famous well in the Bible, Jacob's well. And it tells us some things about it. It tells us that it's a very deep well, and that they can drink of it, that the water is clean, the water is pure, they're able to drink it without being sick. And it also tells us that it has been around for a long, long time, and that Jacob and his family and his descendants, all the way up until time of Jesus in this passage of scripture here, and even their cattle had been drinking of this water. So this was a very deep water with clean water in it that they could drink. Okay, now you say, well, that's just one well for the whole world, for the whole known world at that time. That's just one well. Okay, well, let's talk about other mentions of wells. The first time a well is mentioned is in Genesis chapter 16, verse 14. Matter of fact, some of these we will read. Genesis chapter number 16. I'm going to turn there in my King James Bible here. Genesis chapter number 16, verse number 14. Wherefore the well was called Beer Laharoah. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So at the very first mention, there's a well there. Genesis 21:30. And Genesis 26:18, they tell us of wells that were near different encampments of the people. Genesis chapter number 24 and verse number 11 tells us about a well that was outside the city. 2 Samuel chapter number 17 verse 18 talks about how that there was a well in the courtyard of a house. Second Chronicles chapter 26 verse 10 tells us about many wells in the desert. in places where people would think they would have no water. The Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 26:10 about many wells in the desert. Matter of fact, let's look at that one. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 and verse number 10. 2 Chronicles chapter number 26 and verse number 10. Many wells in the desert. 2 Chronicles 26:10. Also he built towers in the desert and digged many wells. For he had much cattle both in the low country and in the plains, husbandmen also, and vine dressers in the mountains and in Carmel, for he loved husbandry. But notice there it says also he built towers in the desert and digged many wells in the desert. Psalm 84:6, supplied by the rain. Exodus 15:27, 12 wells all in one place. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 11, Canaan blessed with many wells. Song of Solomon chapter 4 verse 15, many wells supplied from Lebanon. 2 Samuel 23:15 talks about a well in Bethlehem. Numbers 21:16 talks about a well in beer. Now, I'm not talking about alcohol beer, and not talking about it was filled with beer. It was in a place called that, and there was a well there. Genesis chapter 26 verse 20, a well in Esek. Genesis 21:19 talks about Hagar's well. Genesis 29 verses 3 and 4 talks about the well of Haran. Genesis 26:22 talks about the well of Rehoboth. Genesis 26:21, the well of Sitnah. So here we see that's just going through the Old Testament there, just some of the first books of the Old Testament. We see many mentions of wells from Genesis all the way up to the times of Jesus. There were wells. So the argument they drink wine in biblical times because they had no clean sources of water is just totally false. That is something that somebody had made up to try to justify their alcoholism, and it's just been passed on, and people just repeat what they've heard because they don't want to give up their sinful lifestyle. They don't want to give up their sin. And so they drink wine in biblical times because they had no clean sources of water is false. Okay? There was many sources of water. The most famous one, Jacob's well, was a deep well. And Jacob, all the way up to the time of Jesus, Jacob, his family, his descendants, even their cattle, drank from this well. Matter of fact, I believe Jacob's well still exists today. The Bible talks about how there was wells near all the encampments of the Jews, and how there were wells outside the cities, and how there was a well inside of a courtyard of a house, and many wells out in the desert. There were many digged in the desert. Talks about wells supplied by the rain. 12. There was 12 wells in one place. Canaan was blessed with many wells. Many supplied from Lebanon. And it talks about a well in Bethlehem and Beer and Esek. And Hagar's well, the well of Haran, the well of Rehoboth, the well of Sitnah, and the list goes on and on and on about many clean water wells for people to have to drink. So the argument, they had to drink wine in biblical times because they had no clean sources of water or no means of purification of the water, just doesn't hold water. Okay, it doesn't work. There was plenty of clean water around, so that argument doesn't work. Okay, so that's episode number 2 in our series on alcohol. They drank wine in biblical times because they had no clean sources of water, no means of purification, and that's just totally false, inaccurate. Okay, so we can't use that as a way to justify alcoholism today.